Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to see you all on our next webinar, where we will talk about how to build an actionable data strategy. We're excited to have Nigel Turner with us today, who's a principal consultant in global data strategy, and he's also a committee member of our sister chapter, DAMA UK. So we are also happy to see our colleagues from other DAMA chapters presenting on one of our events. As a DAMA community, we're excited about sharing the knowledge about data management, data strategy, and governance with more and more people. So again, happy to have Nigel present to us today. And without further ado, Nigel, the stage is yours. Let's rock and roll.
Okay, rock and roll. Thank you, Alexander, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending this webinar. Here where I live in the UK, we can only imagine how difficult all your lives are at the moment. And just to say to start that my thoughts are with you all and with all Ukrainian people with what you're going through at the moment, and may you come out successful from the end of it. The topic today that I'm going to talk about is something that's becoming very popular in the data management community at the moment, and I'll explain why in a second. And it's this idea of a data strategy. And I would argue that any organization that wants to be data driven, that claims to be digital, needs a data strategy. And I'll sort of explain what I mean by a data strategy and why I think every organization needs it. And basically, I was going to say as well, a little bit about me just to start. I won't go on too long about this, but as you can see from looking at me, I've been doing this sort of work for a very long time, over 35 years now. And 27 years of that I've spent in data management. Before that, I was a university teacher in Canada and in the UK. Basically, since about 2010, I've been a consultant in various companies. And then back in 2015, I co-founded a small consultancy company called Global Data Strategy with a US colleague of mine called Donna Burbank. And we've been running global data strategy ever since. And as Alexander already mentioned, I'm also a committee member of DAMA UK, and my main role, appropriately, I suppose, is I'm responsible for liaison with other DAMA chapters across the European, Middle East, and African region. And today I'm speaking from Cardiff in Wales in the UK. Hence, you'll see the Welsh flag there and not the flag of Great Britain. My agenda today, and just a warning, really, those of you coming on to this expecting me to be talking a lot about technology are going to be disappointed, because I think one of the mistakes that people make with data strategies is that they do become technology strategies and not data strategies. A data strategy is really all about what data do we have and do we process? How good is that data? Does it meet business needs? What are our future data needs to service the needs of our business? And how do we develop our data management capabilities to deliver that? That's what a data strategy should be all about, not about what IT do we need. I think IT is a separate subject. Obviously, it can help to deliver, and I will touch on technology a little bit, but most of this isn't about the technology. It's about the data itself. And you can see there, the agenda I've laid out is in three parts, really. What a data strategy is and what it isn't. What's the relationship, I think, between business and data strategies as well, which is, I think, has changed. And then how to build a roadmap. And what I'm going to do is share the four-step approach that we use in my organization, Global Data Strategy. We've gone into many organizations and helped them build a data strategy. And we use this very simple four-step process. And then once you've gone through that four-step process, I just want to briefly touch at the end on the importance of data governance in developing and also in operationalizing any data strategy. I've then got a couple of very short use cases as to where organizations have benefited from that, and we'll draw some conclusions. So why do we need a data strategy? Well, I've always been struck by this diagram that came out 6 years ago from Gartner. And you can see in that when I was brought up in the IT world and the world of data, we were all told that any business had three key capabilities. It had people, it had business processes, and it had technology which underpinned those processes and enabled people to do their jobs. Back in 2018, Gartner said, we're moving into the digital world. Companies are becoming more data-driven and digital, and therefore we need to start thinking about data as the fourth core capability of any organization. And that's a view I certainly would adhere to and believe in. Rather than data being, if you like, a product of process and technology and people, it's a capability in its own right. And therefore, if you want to be a serious data-driven digital business, it's really important to have control of that data asset in the way that the other assets were controlled. And if you think about it, if you look at the traditional three capabilities, pretty much every organization has something like a human resources strategy, which talks about recruitment processes, skills, career development, people retention, etc. Yes, every organization for a long time has had some sort of an IT strategy to ensure that it's investing in the right technologies to support the business. And many organizations, particularly manufacturing companies, need process strategies. So how do you automate our process? How do you develop them? But now I think with this fourth capability, logically, therefore, if data becomes a capability in its own right, then a data strategy is needed to actually drive how data should be improved and how data should therefore support people, process, and technology. So that's, I think, for me, the data has a value in its own right. And that's been recognized, I think, by many organizations. And every year in the UK, DAMA runs a survey of our members. And we've got around 2,000 members in the UK, about 80 organizations are DAMA UK members. And we put out a survey every year to ask people, what are their key priorities over the year? And you'll see there, data strategy, 60% of the people that we interviewed said that data strategy is a key priority. It's always interesting when you see these things. All the talk in the industry is about things like AI, machine learning, ethics, data privacy, and all the rest of it. But actually, when you ask our members what their key priorities are, they're still very much focused on what I would call the foundational disciplines of data management. Things like how do we govern our data and make people accountable for it? How do we manage the quality of our data? And also, what's our strategy for developing our data capabilities? So the importance of strategy has been recognized, I think, anyway, by most organizations these days. And there are other good reasons as well why you need a strategy for your data. I quite like that quote there from an old US baseball player who basically said, if you don't know where you were going, you'll end up somewhere else. And that's certainly true. And I've seen that in many organizations we've gone in. There are organizations that think that data simply evolves in its own way without proper planning and proper control. And of course, it doesn't. You end up in a mess if you allow your data to grow without real controls and real direction over it. And I like that quote as well from Ellie Pido, who basically said strategy is a fancy word for putting together a plan and then putting that into action. So start with some basic definitions. And I mentioned earlier I was going to talk about the relationship between business strategies and data strategies. That's a definition at the top. You'll see, what is a business strategy? Well, it's a medium to long-term business plan. And by medium to long-term, we normally mean between, say, 2 and 5 years. It's pointless trying to go beyond that, as we all know, because the world changes so quickly. Which details the aims and objectives of the business and how it's going to achieve them. And our definition of a data strategy really sort of reflects that in some way. So I think a data strategy is a medium to long-term plan. Normally, when we do a data strategy for an organization, we focus very heavily on the first 3 years, and then if we think it's appropriate. And our definition of a data strategy really reflects that. I think I could hear myself come back then. Anyway, there we go. So it's a medium to long-term plan. So 3 years is what we normally look at. Sometimes we may go to year 4 and year 5, but that might be quite fuzzy. It depends on the maturity of the organization and the clarity of their business planning. But what the data strategy should be doing is how is our data going to be improved? How are we going to manage it? And how are we going to exploit it in order to support our business goals? Now, question that often comes up, which should come first, a business strategy or a data strategy? Now, if you asked me that question 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, it would be quite clear what most people would say. Most people would say, well, the first thing you need to do is define your business strategy, and then you can define a data strategy to support and help to realize your business strategy. But I think in the world of digital data-driven enterprises, I think things are different. And I think they're different in this way, which is that, yes, the business strategy should certainly inform and guide your data strategy. But if you think about it, if you're a data-driven business, then your data strategy can actually help to develop your business strategy. And I'll give you an example of that later, where I think those two things interact very closely. In other words, if you develop your data capabilities, you might be able to do new things as a business that you couldn't do before. So I think these two become, in a digital enterprise, now become much more equal partners in developing each other. Okay, so yes, you need a business strategy. Yes, you need a data strategy, but the two should evolve together. So as your data maturity improves, you can then do new things in the business. So that means your data strategy is impacting your business strategy. But then if your business strategy say, we're going to sell our products in a new part of the world, that has an implication for your data strategy. So those two things are mutually supporting. And ideally, those two strategies should be aligned together. One of the issues that you do come across a lot when we go into organizations, and you see the quote there from 2022, is that only about a third of organizations have a data strategy that is fully aligned with their business strategy. And of course, if those two things aren't aligned and they are not in step, then you end up developing data strategies that don't support the current business, or a business strategy that's impossible to deliver because your data isn't fit for purpose to support that. And that's where things can go wrong. And I also think as well, and I always highlight this when I talk to data management people, that I think changes our roles as data management professionals. Rather than people traditionally, as I did when I started life in data management, sitting in a dark room somewhere in the corner of a building, ignored by the business, just being told, get on and do your techie stuff. Then in a digital enterprise, in a data-driven enterprise, I think that the data professional now has a much bigger role to play. So data management people are ideally placed, if they develop data strategies, to find new opportunities, that the data that they are beginning to develop can be used to benefit the business. They can help to create efficiencies. We all know data quality leads to inefficiency, and therefore, better data quality can help to improve business processes, for example. We can look at integrating data from many different silos and sources, and that can help the business get new insights which it can take action on. And obviously as well, supporting the organizational change, and I'll touch on that later, that all organizations need in order to realize and make their data strategy a reality. So I think our role as data management professionals has changed quite significantly since then. So okay, so what is a data strategy? Just take a pause there to take a quick drink, as I still have a cold and I apologize for my croaky voice. So I thought it's easier to explain what a data strategy isn't, because these are examples of things that we've seen in organizations that claim to be data strategies. And if you have any of these things and you call it a data strategy, I will guarantee it's doomed to fail. Okay, its chances of success are non-existent. And I've seen data strategies that we would call boil the ocean strategies. So if you try and encompass all the data that your organization stores, processes, and uses, it's going to be too broad. Okay, not all data is equally important. So it's very important in your data strategy to identify what is your critical or key data. And your data strategy should focus on that. Second thing, a data strategy should never be owned by the IT department. And I hope I've sort of already made it clear that if data is a business capability now, which it is according to Gartner, and I agree with that, then the IT department are simply the wrong people to manage it. It should be managed by the business, supported by IT. So as soon as I go into an organization, we say, who owns your data strategy? Or IT does. Then we think that's probably going to cause problems. The other type of mistakes we see, it's, as I mentioned this earlier as well, a data strategy isn't a technology shopping list. So it's not things like we need a data catalog, we need a new data warehouse, we need to build a data lake house, we need to implement data fabric. That's an IT strategy, not a data strategy. And therefore, the other IT strategy and the data strategy should be aligned. But we always say, define your data strategy first before you decide what technology you need. Otherwise, you invest in a lot of technology that doesn't support the data that you need. The other thing is, if it's led and developed from the middle of the organization, again, it'll fail. It has to be something that's driven from the very top, so that the CEO and the board and the executive committee of your organization needs to be actively involved in it, understand its importance to them, and promote it throughout the organization. I've also seen off-the-shelf strategies. Some of the big four consultancy companies are pretty good at this. I won't be too critical of them, but we've seen this, where we've seen a 95-page data strategy where it looks like it could apply to any organization, apart from the fact that the name has been changed in the document to make it relevant to one particular organization. But many of the things we see in those are too generic. They are too general. The other thing we've seen as well, a data strategy is not a set of noble principles and aspirations. We will manage data as an asset. We will make sure we optimize the value of our data. That's not a data strategy, it's a wish list. A data strategy has to be a plan. It should not be long-term either. We were great believers in any good data strategy should address short-term concerns as well as long-term aspirations, and I'll talk about that later. And of course, the other thing as well, which I've implied earlier, it's not something you should set in stone. Another key question we ask, have you got a data strategy? Yes. When was it developed? In 2021. Has it been changed since 2021? No. That probably means it's no longer relevant to the current business, because if the business has changed in the last 3 years and the data strategy hasn't, that's one of the things that causes that misalignment that I talked about earlier. So what should a data strategy be? It's really the opposite of what I've just talked about. So in other words, the key things for us, the important features of a good data strategy are it focuses on the key and most important data that an organization depends on. We're great believers in what's called the Pareto principle, which you may be familiar with, which is that 80% of the value of something is generated by 20% of the effort. So we would say the same thing about data, which is that 20% of your data, if you get that right and you develop it, will give you 80% of the benefits. So we always look at what the critical data is and what the key data is, focus our strategy efforts on that. As I mentioned earlier, it has to be owned from the top. It has to be unique to every organization. So the data strategy that we would produce for an organization, for instance, can only be for that organization and could not apply to anywhere else, simply because every organization is literally unique and everyone is different from any other. And it'll vary, as I'll show you later. Should be holistic as well. So yes, it should encompass people. It should touch on the processes, especially data management processes, and also, yes, touch on technology, but only at a high level, as I'll show you, because you need a technology strategy then to actually develop that further. It should be a collaboration between the business and IT, led by the business. And as Ellie Piddott said earlier, it should be a roadmap or a plan, and therefore it should have milestones, deliverables, and owners attached to it. It's a program plan, in effect, is what we would call it. And it should contain both quick wins and longer term goals. And then there should be some process as well for ensuring that it's adapting to the changing needs of the business. So if you develop a data strategy, how often do you review it? How do you make sure that it continues to be relevant to the current needs of the business? So how do you go about developing a strategy that meets those criteria? I quite like the words of the old Pope, John Paul II, the Polish Pope, of course, who said, the future starts today, not tomorrow. So when we do a data strategy, those are really the four key questions that we think it should answer. The first thing it should do is, if you go on any journey, you need to know two things. You need to know your destination, but you also need to know your starting point. And therefore, the first thing you need to understand is, what are the organization's current goals and objectives? So what is it trying to do today? And then the second question then, what are the current strengths and weaknesses of the data that either enable or prevent its ability to deliver its goals? So, for example, a business goal might be, we want to do one-to-one marketing with all our customers. But if the marketing data isn't good enough to support that, its quality is poor, that will become it'll prevent the ability of the business to do what it wants to do. So the first thing to think about is today. Okay, so what is the current state of data in an organization today? But then you need to think as well about the future. So what does the business want to do in the future that it can't do today? And it could be doing more with existing data, or of course it might be that we need new data capabilities in order to enable us to do things that we cannot do today. And then then the obvious question that follows from that, what new data capabilities would you need in order to support the future needs of the business? So we would say that if you can answer those four questions, then you've basically got the core of a data strategy. And the data strategy should be focused very much around those four things. So how do you begin to answer those questions? I said, I make no apologies for this. Our approach is really simple. It's just got four stages. And normally, if we go into an organization, we would aim to do this in maybe 6 to 8 weeks, potentially. So the first thing we would do is, first of all, understand what the business is trying to achieve today and tomorrow, identify what its current goals and objectives are, and how do these relate to data. And I'll touch back on that later. Then the current step is to say, what's the starting point for our journey? And that means you need to understand the current data management maturity and the environment in which the data is being processed at the moment. Then you can start to think about the future state from what you've done in terms of looking at future goals and capabilities. Then what future state data management capabilities do we need? What potential processes do we need? And do we need to reorganize ourselves in order to deliver that? So we would cover all those things in proposed future state, and then you bring those together into some sort of implementation roadmap or plan, where we would look very carefully to what are your priority activities and how can you identify these things called quick wins. And I'll come back to those later as well, because I think quick wins are vitally important when you're developing a data strategy. So you can see you're developing the strategy from step 1 down to step 4. But then when you're working through that process, clearly there's some iteration goes on as well, that you may get to the roadmap and you may think, we're not really addressing that business goal. So you need to go back to step 1, reevaluate what you're doing, and then come back down again. So, but we usually do a few iterations of this before we end up with something that we're happy to share with our customer. As I said, in each of those stages, there are some key questions that you'd want to answer. And these are some of the ones here that I've highlighted. And I won't go through all of these. You will get a copy of the slides afterwards. So, you can read these for yourselves. But those are some of the key questions that we would ask. And I'm not going to go through them here to save time, but I'll touch on them anyway. So what I'll do is I'll go straight into step 1 and say, how would we set about getting answers to those questions there? What are the key business drivers for data or business change drivers? How can we link data to them? And how can we show value if we improve our data? And who are the stakeholders that we need to engage with to make that happen? So in step 1, really very simple. The first thing we would do, and what I'd recommend anyone does if they do a data strategy, is before you actually go and talk to anybody, do some research. And of course, whether that research will depend on if, like me, you would go into an organization as an external person and understand what that business does. If you work within the business, then you've usually got better access to the sort of documentation that you might need to do that research. So, we would always, for example, before going into a company, look at their annual report. Most companies got annual reports. Those annual reports usually will consist of a series of business goals, business objectives. They might include things like a mission and vision. You certainly find that on many external websites, and what current challenges that business is facing. And those challenges could be external to its environment, so they might be to do with climate change or conflict or anything else, but also its own internal challenges. We need to cut our costs, we need to increase our revenues, whatever it happens to be. We need to become more efficient. And then you can start to think about, how do those goals depend on data? And I've given you a real example here of one that we came across in one company we went into. We discovered in the annual report a business goal that says we want to increase our revenues from our top 10% revenue generating customers. So immediately you can start to think that heavily depends on data. Because, for example, do we know who our top 10% revenue generating customers are? If we've got poor data quality, for example, and many different duplicated records of the same customer, do we know that those duplicated customers are actually the same customer? And then what are the data problems that might stop us doing that? Is the data quality good enough? Do we have a lot of data duplication? Are we missing data, for example? And what are the implications for the business if we can't do these things? And this, I think, is a really good example as well of where the data and business strategies must align, because it's all very well stating that in your business strategy, but if you don't have the data and the data capabilities to support it, you can't achieve it. So that's a good example of where a data strategy and a business strategy need to align with each other. So we would always do that before we go. But the main way we would really gather the information that we need, and you would do this if you were internal to your organization or external, is first of all, who are the key stakeholders in all of this? So who are the people that have most interest in data and developing data capabilities? So we produce something called a stakeholder matrix. I won't go into that today. And importantly, that should include both business people and IT. And then we set up a series of meetings with these people. There is no better way, in our opinion, of getting this information and actually talking to people, which sometimes may seem very old-fashioned, I know, because people don't like talking to people so much these days. But we think that's absolutely critical. And where, depending on the scope and scale of the company, the company culture, we would do these as one-to-one interviews, group interviews where we might, for example, interview a group of salespeople at the same time, or even workshops to actually say, what are your key challenges with your customer data, for example. And the 6 questions that we always would ask, and again, under Pareto, these 6 questions usually give us 80% of what we need to know, are those questions you see there. So, first question, how are you relying on data in your current role? What data do you rely on? What data is most critical to you? What's working well? Because it's always important to ask that question first. What needs to be improved and why does it need to be improved? What are your future data needs? And what could you do with better data that you can't do now? And then also, if you can, to ask what are the current costs of lost opportunities or problems with your data? So if somebody says, well, we'd love to do one-to-one marketing, but our data quality doesn't support it. So what are the implications of that? Do you think that is costing you potential revenue? Yes. Can you say how much revenue? Not really. Do you think if you had better customer data and one-to-one marketing, you could improve your revenues by 10%, 15%? And usually most people will give you a figure if you do that. So you can start to put some quantify some of the financial benefits of doing this. And then the last question we always ask as well is, if you had one wish, one thing that could be better with data, what would it be and why? And I'll explain why we always ask that question. Of course, the other thing to stress there as well is it's important to speak to a wide range of people across the organization. So don't just speak to senior people, because they don't always know what's going on. As we know, they might get a report every Monday morning on their desk and says, here's my report, that gives me all I need to know. What they don't know are the 52 people that spent the previous week putting that report together for them because of data problems. So talk to senior people. Yes, they'll give you the strategic view. Talk to people in the middle of the organization, but also talk to some people on the front line. And some of the best insights I've ever had doing data strategies is talking, for example, to a data entry person or an operations manager who's using data day to day. And they'll say things like, well, if only this was a drop-down menu rather than a free field text, we could do an awful lot more with this data than we currently do. So you get a lot of really good ideas from doing that. And then we would then start to model or analyze some of the information that we've collected. One way of doing it is is a diagram that looks a bit like this. And I'll give you some examples. This is a real one that we did for a client. You'll see on the left-hand side, these are the business change drivers. These are the things the business wants to do in the future that it can't do today. So if you take, if there is a demand for digital self-service for its customers, can't do that at the moment. It also wants to get a 360-degree view of its customers, and it can't do that at the moment. And then from the stakeholder interviews, these are some of the key data challenges that need to be addressed in order to tackle and to realize those business drivers. So, 360-degree view of the customer. To do that, we need to align data, which is held in many different silos, and it's distributed across many regions. So we need some way of pulling all that information together. And then and I'll touch on the right-hand column in a minute, would then start to give you your priorities as to which data management capabilities you need to develop. In this particular example, you'll see the ones marked with stars are the ones that we saw as being the key things to focus on, because those are the things that will address most of the problems that your stakeholders have raised. You need better governance of data. You need better control of master data. You need to improve the way that your data warehouse operates. You need to do some proper data architecture work and manage your metadata more effectively. So immediately that's narrowing down what the focus of your data strategy should be, certainly in the early stages. And then moving on from that as well, remember we asked earlier on, I said about one wish. If you had one wish for data, this is a real one we did. And you can see there, we interviewed, this was quite a big company that we worked in, and we interviewed in the end 63 different people. And we asked every person that same question. If one thing could be better with data, what would you like it to be? And you can see there that 34 of 63 people put customer data as their top priority. So when you're developing your data strategy, immediately that gives you a very clear indication of where the business priorities lie. That the business priorities are all about joining up customer data and using that joined up data to have more insights into your customer base, and therefore to be able to market and sell to them more effectively than you can do at the moment. So if your data strategy doesn't have that as a very key priority, then something is wrong. And then the stuff nearer the bottom, yes, some people think it's important, but it's not as important. And therefore, it might be completely out of your strategy, or it may be something you might think about maybe in year 2 or year 3 of your data strategy, but not something to worry about now. So it's a really good way of beginning to prioritize and focus your efforts on what you need to do. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, prioritizes on your critical data. Then the step 2, once you've done that, and those are just some examples, we would produce obviously a lot more analysis than that, is then look at the current data maturity baseline of the organization. So what you're trying to do here, the first thing is, how good are your current data capabilities? The to be picture is then how good do they need to be? And what areas do we need to develop, as I mentioned earlier? And then filling that gap then in effect becomes your strategy and roadmap. So it's the way of completing the journey between your current origin and your chosen destination point over that period. And that's basically how we would do it. And in order to do that, many of you are very familiar with this, I suspect, we would do some sort of current state data management maturity assessment. And if you notice there are 12 categories that we use. 11 of them we have reused from DAMA. So you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the DAMA DMBOK. And 11 of those categories you see there are from the DMBOK. So we actually use the DMBOK as the basis of a maturity assessment. We've added one, which DMBOK doesn't have, which is the strategy itself at the top. So we would assess at the moment, are there any existing strategies, for example, business strategies that are already in place that would help us to develop more easily our data strategy? Or is it an IT strategy, for example, that might touch on a data strategy, or a digital strategy that could help to develop a data strategy as well? So we have that 12th dimension. And then what we do after we've done the interviews is we then have our own, but you can do this in many different ways. I mean, I know companies who have just used DMBOK and developed some of these criteria from DMBOK. We've got about 120 questions that we then assess the current maturity against. And you see their current state and future state. Future state can, both those can be 1, which is immature, to 5, which is very mature. And then by assessing the current state against the future state, we can then see what the gap is and then start to develop the actions that are needed to be taken in order to address those. And what on the future state note, not every future state needs to be a 5, which is the most mature. So in this particular organization, for example, I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, our data strategy is published and well understood. The current state is 2. There is some sort of a strategy, but it's not well articulated and it's not well understood. So there needs to be some work there. And in the future, it needs to be a lot better, but not necessarily the very best for reasons that I won't go into now. And then once you've done that, of course, what you can then do is start to draw up things like this that then helps the organization see where the gaps currently are. So this again is a real one, not the same as previously, but you can see there that in this particular company, the biggest gap they had and the thing they most needed to address was data governance. They were an organization, the green line, by the way, is their current state. The blue state is where we felt they needed to be in 3 years. So there was a big gap between data governance, between the current state and where we felt they needed to be in 3 years' time. So that implies there's a big focus on data governance is really vitally important. There was also, but they also, you then discovered things like they were very strong on data architecture, but in fact, they were so strong, they were stifling innovation and stifling new uses of the data. That's quite rare, but it does happen. And on metadata management, they were actually pretty good. So they were already had the capabilities they needed to support their current and future data needs. They'd invested in a data catalog. They'd spend a lot of time populating that catalog and embedding it within their systems estate. So that was good. So that immediately again starts to say biggest priority data governance, also data quality needs addressing, and probably BI and data warehousing as well. So those again are narrowing down the focus. And of course, once you've done that, then you can, I'm not going to go through this, you'd be pleased to know. This is an example again from another customer, which I've anonymized. And once you've got that sort of picture, and in this particular case, if you see 3 lines on it, the current state was green. The state we felt they needed to be at in 2 years' time was the blue line, and the yellow line was where they needed to be in 5 years' time. So we did do this over a 5-year period. And the colors here simply reflect the red, amber, and green markings that you showed earlier. But then this is a good way as well of saying these are the key areas where development is needed. Then we do look at data architecture, but only at a very high level. So this is the only techie bit of this whole thing. Okay, so we will always do something like this, which is a very high level picture of it, main applications that process and manage data and how the data flows between them. And again, as I mentioned here, this is an existing a customer that we worked with in the past. By simply looking at this diagram, you can see that they have a big issue in product management. And their issue in product management, as you can see immediately, was a huge reliance on Excel spreadsheets. And this was extremely inefficient, very manually intensive, and was causing them real issues. And then once you've laid it out like that, what you can then do is talk about some of the key pain points, if you like, that are present in that current data architecture. And again, that is then giving you more clues, more ideas of actions that are needed in order to develop the data capabilities to be fit for the business purpose for which it was desired. What we could then do as we move then into step 3 as well is produce an example future state architecture. So this particular architecture would solve a lot of the issues that were seen in the current architecture. And then you can also, again, you can read this at your leisure if you choose to. You can then say these are the things that you need. And this is where it does touch the IT strategy in order to develop the data capabilities that you need. I'm just giving you some examples. We would produce a lot more things than this, but this is a good way of presenting, if you like, and selling a data strategy to other people. And finally, you know, from all this, you then try to produce this thing called a roadmap. And before you do that, one of the things that we always think is vitally important with a data strategy is a data strategy does not sell itself. You have to actively sell it to the business and to the stakeholders that you've been interviewing and talking to, okay? And, you know, that's because you have to be aware of the culture of the organization. The culture may be very resistant to doing new things, for example. And as Peter Drucker says in that quote I like, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So however good your strategy is, if you don't actively sell it to your stakeholders, there's a very good chance they'll go, yeah, but we don't want to do that. So you've really got to get them involved and excited by what you're trying to do. And so, you know, a communications activity within your data strategy is vitally important. So you want to provide a vision for what the future could look like. Give them examples of how things would be different in the future to the way it's done today. Show them how the journey would happen between where you are today and where you need to be. Explain those steps, and also vitally as well for the stakeholders, explain everybody's role in that journey. You know, where would they fit in this, and what skills do they need? So doing stakeholder analysis is a key part of any good data strategy. So if you think, okay, you've got a CFO, a chief finance officer who you know is supportive of your data strategy, what are you going to give him or her that will continue to make them strong supporters of what you're trying to do? How is it going to benefit them? So we do quite a lot of that change management, stakeholder analysis type activity before we ever present the strategy back. And you get the hang of this already, that this isn't a purely scientific activity. It's part an art and part of science. You're trying to keep people happy and on board, but at the same time lay out a logical sequence of activities that the organization needs to do. And it's quite a balancing act. And then, of course, that means that when you're then developing the strategy itself, you are actually, it becomes a business case in its own right. So I mentioned earlier on, you know, when you present it back, what sort of audience are you presenting it to? Are you in a company where everybody wants a PowerPoint presentation or a 100-page document, for example? Our chosen a preferred method of a data strategy is always PowerPoint. That we would always try and lay it out in about 20 core slides, some examples of which I've shown you, with maybe other slides as backup slides if people want more detail. But if you can't explain your data strategy in less than 20 PowerPoint slides, you're going into far too much detail, in my opinion. And we would always avoid doing 100-page documents because nobody ever reads them. Okay, we have been to clients who said, can you do a Word document for us? That's the way we operate. We might do a 20-page Word document. We certainly wouldn't do 100 pages. And therefore, you know, you need to make sure that happens. The other thing as well is, you know, when you lay out your strategy and your roadmap, start small and then have a plan as to how you're going to get to your longer term goal. And we always, as well, to try and bring it to life, you know, from the interviews that you've done, try and gather metrics and anecdotes as well. So where you know specific examples where better data will save costs or gain you new revenues, where data quality improvement will improve business processes, for example, or you know, breaches of compliance and regulatory rules that you may be aware of. These things always help to bring it to life. So whenever we can, we try and sort of enliven this, if you like, with real examples of things that we found as we develop the strategy. And, you know, that usually makes people sit up and take notice. And then, of course, as I said as well, I mentioned earlier the importance of quick wins. And what we mean by quick wins are things that meet those criteria. So a quick win might be there's an immediate business problem. We came across one recently where two parts of the same organization were using two different country code tables, and those country code tables didn't match each other. And that was causing lots of confusion in their reporting. So a quick win would be to say, set up a working group, agree on which of these country code tables is going to be standard, convert the non-standard one to the standard one, that's a quick win. That can be achieved in 2 or 3 months, probably. Okay, so that would be a good example of a quick win with longer term benefits coming from that. Very often we find data quality improvements are often very good quick wins because they are things that can be delivered relatively quickly. Particularly, for example, if you're doing a data cleanse of a data source and you're going to improve data validation, for instance, that can be done relatively quickly sometimes. Depends on the application. So quick wins very important. So to summarize, because I'm conscious I'm getting near the end, what would the data strategy contain? Laid out in a PowerPoint format, it would look something like that. So you'd put an executive summary on it with some headlines. You then talk about the business context, that model I showed you. You know, what are the current business drivers? How do they depend on data? Then what is our key data? So what is the most important data to focus on and to improve? What are the current problems with that data? Then what are our key objectives in our data strategy? And our roadmap would then lay out a sequence of activities which would cover those periods there. So our quick wins would be normally in the 0 to 6 months periods. So that's where you'd be looking for your quick wins, with then the longer term stuff coming after that. And also, of course, as well, how do you then measure that the data strategy is succeeding? What are your KPIs? So you need to lay out some KPIs as well. So if you do all that, and then when you lay out that roadmap, we always try and do it that looked in a way that looks something like this. And therefore, you know, we like to create these things called headline themes because you're trying to sell this and get people excited about it. And again, this was a real one we did for a client. So you can see there, this was a 3-year period. Year 1 was all about building foundation and trust in data. So that would be putting some data governance in place, for example, running data quality projects to improve key problem areas. Year 2 would then be growing as a result of that better foundation that you put in place, becoming more efficient. Then by year 3, then talking about potential market leadership for this particular organization. So that tells a story, if you like, as to how they are maturing across that 3-year period. And I mean, the final point I'd like to make, I mentioned it earlier, and this is a topic in its own right anyway, which is that, you know, how do data strategy and data governance interrelate? Well, in our opinion, I've never seen a data strategy being successfully implemented without data governance. The reason for that is data governance very firmly puts data leadership in the hands of business people and not IT people. So, you know, any data governance program, as I'm sure you will all know, has data owners, it has data stewards, data champions, for example. Those are the right people to implement the data strategy because they own the data and they are responsible for it. So they should be driving the improvement projects that your roadmap has identified. So they provide the means to deliver the data strategy and also, as it's being delivered, to enforce compliance with that. So if somebody says, I want to do something new and something different, is it in the data strategy? No, the data owner should be able to say, you're not doing that. We need either you're not doing that or you need to make the case to change the data strategy to include what you need to do. So you include that discipline, if you like. And the other way around, of course, once you've defined your data strategy, that will then help to set the priorities for your data governance activities. So your data owners, data stewards, what should they be focused on? They should be focused on the key data improvements that need to be made in the data strategy. So I believe those two things are completely mutually dependent. So to summarize, if you're going to develop a successful data strategy, what ultimately we would aim to do is to hit that sweet spot in that Venn diagram where the business needs and drivers for data, the critical data elements, the most important data, the capabilities of the organization, and solving problems and creating new opportunities all come together in that sweet spot in the middle. And that's where the main focus of any data strategy should be, is on that sweet spot in the center, where those things are all brought together in an aligned way. And very quickly, I won't take long on these because of time. You'll see there a couple of use cases of where we've been involved with other companies and done this. We did a lot of work in the US with when 2 big insurance companies merged together, and they realized very quickly, in order to reap the benefit of that merger, they needed a data strategy. So because each had a very different approach to their data. So we worked with them for around 18 months, 2 years, and actually built a data strategy that united the two new businesses together, and then actually went on and built subsidiary data strategies for some of the constituent parts of their business. And you can see there's some of the benefits of doing that. Another example, very different environment. This was with a children's services company in the USA. And this was an organization that were looking after vulnerable children or children who were seen to be in danger. And we worked with them to build a data strategy a few years ago. We're still working with them today. And as a result of their data strategy that they presented to the funding authorities in their state in the USA, they got a 5-year grant to help deliver all this stuff. So because they had a well-defined data strategy with their priorities and deliverables clearly laid out, that helped them to actually win the funding that they needed. So another good example of a very different type of use case. So last slide to summarize. This, as you know, is many of you will recognize this as the Parthenon in Athens, where I was lucky to go a few years ago. Brilliant place. Important thing about the Parthenon is the temple that sits on top here is the famous bit, but before they built the temple, the Greeks spent many years flattening out the top of this hill to give it a good foundation. And if you're going to develop a data strategy, I think what you need to do is combine exactly that. So you need to concentrate on solid foundations. So your governance, your architecture, your quality, your master data have to be very well managed. But at the same time, to excite people and think and be future looking, you also then need to think about things like analytics and AI and all the other things that come with that. And those two things can be delivered together through pilots, improving data quality in an area, applying AI to it, for example. So always try and look to combine those two things. And remember, as I said before, as you build this, it's part art and part science, just like the Parthenon was part art, brilliant architecture, but then was built through it by engineers 3,000 years ago. And final quote, why do you need a data strategy? I like this quote by my favorite painter, Vincent van Gogh, who said the great things are not done by impulse, but by a series of small things brought together. And great things are not accidental, but must certainly be willed. And if you want to be great with your data, you need a data strategy to make sure that it's not accidental and something that you want and you will. And there's my contact details there. Thank you for your focus and attention. I wish you all the very best and please stay safe. And I've got some time, I think 5 minutes at least, Alexandra, if anyone's got any questions or comments.
Yeah, we have a question from Pablo in the chat. So Nigel, can you read the chat, or should
Yeah,
I read the question too?
go off. I'll go off full screen and I might be able to see it then.
For sure.
Bear with me. Yes, chat, got it. I can see it now.
Perfect.
No, okay, yes. Oh, right. Here we go. So who was this from? From Pablo, you said.
Correct.
How do you set yeah. I think that is it's a good point, Pablo. I actually think that is a weakness of DMBOK, and we have flagged that in because DMBOK sort of starts with an assumption that you already have a data strategy, and therefore your data management capability should be developed as a on the basis of that data strategy. But many organizations, in fact, most organizations that I've been in, and I've been in a lot in the last 10 years, didn't have a data strategy when we went in. They had an IT strategy, yes, they had a business strategy, but they didn't really have a data strategy. So I agree with you. I think the next version of DMBOK should include that, and we have flagged that up to the authors. Whether they'll include it or not remains to be seen. But it should be coming out hopefully next year. But there will be a lot of updates in the next version because the current version of DMBOK, for example, makes no mention of this thing called artificial intelligence, which has become somewhat important since it was last published. Yeah.
That's correct. And by the way, that's a great comment. That if someone some of you would like to actually provide some feedback to the DMBOK, just please reach out to our DAMA chapter, and we as a chapter we have the right to actually propose any updates or changes to the new DMBOK release. So feel free to reach out if you would like to contribute or you have some feedback or anything like that. So great.
Yeah,
So and we have.
I'd encourage you to do that. We're lucky in the UK because one of the committee of authors of DMBOK is actually a DAMA UK member. He's on our committee, so we feed it all through him. But it is, you can still do that even if not.
Yeah, I know you guys did a great job actually defining the key six key quality dimensions, which actually were
Yeah,
also included in the DMBOK release. I personally use all six of data quality dimensions when I need to talk about data quality. So your contribution is really great. And we have a question from
yeah.
Dmitro as well.
Yeah, I can see that question, Dimitri. Yeah, I agree with you. How do you track that alignment between business and data strategy? This is why it's vitally important that the data strategy is led from the top of the organization, because, and this is where governance comes in as well. We try and explain. Let's take, for example, I worked as a temporary CDO last year in an organization. Because I was a CDO, I was on the board of the organization, which was a challenge when I was brand new to it. But at the same time, I was responsible for the data strategy. So by being plugged into the board, I had a slot at every board meeting to say, what business changes should I be aware of to make sure that the data strategy remains aligned? And this is why I think data governance comes into it as well, because if you set up, let's say, a steering committee to implement your data strategy, and that steering committee consists of data owners, for example, then they should also be aware of business changes that you can feed in. So, we wouldn't recommend that you update the data strategy on a real-time basis. Every time there's a change, update it. But there should at least be a formal review. We would recommend at least every 3 months, and maybe ideally every month, depending on if you've got a steering group. One of the standard items of a steering group agenda should be business changes and impact on data strategy. There's something in the business that wasn't very important 3 months ago, suddenly become very important, and therefore the data strategy needs to be revisited to see whether that's continuing to support that. So yeah, you're right. It has to be that alignment. That's why I mentioned that quote earlier. 70% of organizations don't have that alignment, is because they don't go through that process. It's a very simple process, but a very essential one.
Thanks, Nigel. And a question from my side: How would you approach a situation when a company already has some kind of what they call technology-driven data strategy? For instance, I personally have examples of clients who just bought a pretty expensive license for Alation data catalog, or for example Calibra. They're paying every year, but
Yeah.
they're not using it because they
Yeah.
just don't know what to use it for. They're paying money, but they're not realizing this value. So how would you kind of reformulate or maybe fix the data strategy for them in that case?
Well, I think the first thing you'd say is, once you've defined the data strategy, you're in a much better position to say, why isn't Calibra being used? And is Calibra actually the right tool for the organization? And and certainly if we were interviewing the stakeholders, we would be aware of Calibra, and we would ask them about the issues with Calibra and why it's not being used. But I'm unfortunately, organizations are full of technologies that aren't being used. And we've seen this time and time again. And there are some vendors out there who are very good at saying, if you buy our tool, it will solve your governance problems, it will solve your strategy problems. Believe you me, it doesn't. Okay. And we have an old quote in the UK, which is, a fool with a tool is still a fool. So if you don't know what you need the tool for, don't buy the tool. Be clear, get your data strategy right first, and from that should be some recommendations about potentially the need for new technology. So in a data strategy, we might often say, you don't manage your metadata well. Metadata is vitally important for accurate reporting, and therefore you need to invest in a data catalog. Now, we wouldn't necessarily go beyond that. That would then become part of the IT strategy to say, which data catalog do we need? So the data strategy would then serve, if you like, as a requirements document into the choice of which data catalog you would need. It depends on the needs of the data strategy. If it was or it could be like the same with MDM. So if you're saying we need to master our customer and product data, then that's a requirement for an MDM tool that you might need. But the trouble is, in many organizations, they buy the tool and then think, what can we do with it? Rather than, this is our need, what's the right tool for what we're trying to do?
All right, thank you for your answer. Any more questions from our attendees? All right, so I think with that, let's thank you, Nigel, for a really amazing presentation. I really personally enjoyed it. For our attendees, if you need to have a copy of the slide deck, just reach out to us. We'll share one afterwards.
Yep.
So I wish everyone have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and subscribe to our LinkedIn page and stay tuned for our upcoming events.
Okay, thank you for your time. Good luck. Stay safe. Thank you,
Yes,
Alexander.
bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.